Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. Mr. Dillet had spotted an object amongst the clutter in the second-hand shop, which he pointed out with his stick, casually commenting that it must be a common find. The dealer, Mr. Chittenden, replied that it was a museum piece and genuine, that a finer piece could not be found. After about half an hour of bartering, Mr. Dillet had purchased the item for 60 guineas, had it packed and driven it away in his car. Mr. Chittenden retreated to the parlour at the back of the shop and gleefully told his wife, "It's gone." On hearing that Mr. Dillet had bought it, Mrs. Chittenden commented that he'd be none the worse for a bit of a shake-up as they sat down to tea, relieved and thankful that they were rid of the ancient doll's house. There was only just enough room for the massive doll's house in Mr. Dillet's car as he carefully drove the 10 miles home. It had been stuffed with soft cotton wool in view of the immense number of small objects it contained, and Mr. Dillet needed the help of his butler in conveying it to his spacious room on the first floor. There he spent the next hour or two extracting the padding and setting in order the contents of the rooms. It was a perfect and attractive specimen of a doll's house in Strawberry Hill Gothic style, quite 6 feet long, and included a chapel with a bell in the turret and stable with its proper complement of horses, coaches and grooms. When the front of the house was open, you saw 4 large rooms, bedroom, dining room, drawing room and kitchen, each with its appropriate furniture in a very complete state. Congratulating himself on his bargain acquisition, Dillet then arranged the resident population before him. There were a gentleman in blue satin and a lady in a brocade dress, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. There was a cook, a nurse, a footman and stable servants, a coachman and 2 grooms. Searching for other figures, Dillet found that the curtains of the 4-poster bed in the bedroom were closely drawn around all 4 sides of it, and he put his finger in between them and felt in the bed. He drew the finger back hastily, for it seemed that something had not stirred perhaps, but yielded in an odd live way as he pressed it. Then he pulled back the curtains and extracted from the bed a white-haired old gentleman in a long linen nightdress and cap. He laid him down by the others, and the tale was now complete. Dinner time was near, and Dillet quickly placed the lady and children into the drawing room, the gentleman into the dining room, the servants into the kitchen and stables, and the old man back into his bed. At around 11, he retired to his own 4-poster bed in a highly complacent frame of mind. There was no striking clock within earshot, none in the house or even a distant clock tower, but Dillet was startled out of a very pleasant slumber by a bell tolling 1. He was so shaken up by this that, breathless and with wide-open eyes, he actually sat up in his bed. He never asked himself until the next day how it was that, although there was no light in the room, the doll's house on his bedroom table stood out with complete clearness. But it was so, the effect of a bright harvest moon shining fully on a big white stone mansion, seemingly far away, but every detail photographically sharp. Astonishingly, there are also trees around it, and he could hear an occasional stamp and clink of horses stirring in the stable. And with another shock, he realised that above the house he was looking, not at his bedroom wall with its pictures, but into the profound blue of the night sky. There were lights in the house windows where he gazed earnestly. Through the lower dining room window he saw the man and woman sitting at the table talking, every now and then seeming to stop and listen. The man came to the window and put his head out, his hand to ear, then left the room, while the woman stood, lit taper in hand. The expression on her face was one of fear, but also hate. Now the man came back, and she took some small thing from his hand, then hurried out. He then disappeared, then emerged as the front door slowly opened, and he stepped out, looking around. He turned towards the lit upper window and shook his fist. In the upper room, a nurse sat sleeping in an armchair beside an old man in a four-post bed who lay awake and anxiously drummed his fingers on the coverlet. The lady entered, roused the nurse, and bid her warm some wine she poured from an old-fashioned bottle. The old man feebly beckoned to the lady, who smilingly took his pulse, then bit her lip as if in consternation. He anxiously pointed to the window and spoke, to which she opened the casement and listened in an exaggerated way, then shook her head at the old man, who sighed. He seemed disinclined to drink the warmed potion, but the lady and nurse raised him to sitting position and pressed him to drink most of it. The lady then smiled good night to him and left the room, carrying the utensils and wine bottle. After an interval of complete quiet, the old man started up in his bed and must have uttered some cry as the nurse rushed to his side. He was a sad and terrible sight, his face flushed almost to blackness, eyes glaring and lips foaming, both hands clutching at his heart. The nurse ran to the door and screamed aloud for help. Then the lady, her husband, and several servants rushed into the room with horrified faces. But the old man collapsed under the nurse's hands and lay back, and his features, contorted with agony and rage, relaxed slowly into calm. A few moments later, a coach drove up to the house door, and a white-wigged man, carrying a small leather trunk-shaped box, got nimbly out and ran up the steps. He was met at the doorway by the man and his wife, she clutching a handkerchief, and he with a tragic face. The newcomer listened with a face of consternation to what they had to tell, nodding and brandishing papers from his bag. Within a few minutes, he slowly came down the steps, entered the coach, and drove off the way he had come. As the man in blue watched him from the top of the steps, an unpleasant smile stole slowly over his face. As darkness fell, Dillet remained sitting up and rightly guessed that there would be a sequel. The house lights glimmered again, but now another illuminated the coloured windows of the chapel. He was able to look through to its lush interior, where on the centre of the tiled pavement was a bier where 4 tall candles burned at the corners. On the bier was a coffin covered with a shroud of black velvet. Inside the house, the children lay in their beds, while their parents, now dressed in mourning, talked and laughed animatedly. The father placed the old man's nightgown over his head, pretending to be a ghost and scaring them, as still Dillet watched as if frozen. A new, pale, ugly light seemed to emerge at the back of the room, as something like a frog, the size of a man, but with sparse white hair about its head, entered and played around the children's beds. The sound of cries, faint as if from a vast distance, but even so infinitely appalling, reached the ear, and a hideous commotion erupted throughout the house. Lights moved around, doors opened and shut, and running figures passed within windows. The chapel clock told 1, and darkness fell again. It was only dispelled to reveal lines of dark figures holding flaming torches emerging at the house steps. They bore first one, then another, small coffin, moving silently onward to the left. The hours of night passed slowly, and Dillet did not close an eye again. Early next morning he sent for the doctor, who found him in a disquieting state of nerves and recommended sea air. He repaired to a quiet place on the east coast, where one of the first people he met on the seafront was Mr. Chittenden. He likewise had been advised to take his wife away for a bit of a change. He looked somewhat askance at Dillet's upset with him over the nightly tragic reenactment of the doll's house, and offered him his money back. They later discussed the terrifyingly regular 1 a.m. haunting and agreed that the visitor was no medical man but the lawyer because of the papers he carried, that he had the old man's will ready to be signed, which probably would have cut out the younger couple. The haunted doll's house now resides in a loft over Dillet's stables, but he still has to sometimes clap his hands to his ears when the wind conveys from the distant loft that 1 a.m. bell toll.